We're live. Shalom Aleichem, people. What's going on? It is Eitan ben Avraham here for Aleph Mail in the Holy Land of Israel, and I am with an old friend and good friend, and man, you would not even believe how I met this guy, Moshe Hazan, in the house. Like, our whole dynamic is rooted in Hashgacha Pratit.
Right.
The root of our relationship is miraculous, but we're not going to go into that just this second.
That's a whole show. That's like
that's like a story in and of itself. And today is Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer as we count towards Shavuot, and it is the 18th day of the Hebrew month of Iyar. It is celebrating the passing day, the yahrzeit of Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a Tana from the times of the Gemara, and he, on the day of somebody's passing, there's an idea that their energy comes back into the world. And so on this day, we're going to talk about Rebbe Shimon. And 1 second, I'm just sharing this, going deep into Lag BaOmer with Moshe Hazan.
Amazing.
Okay. Should I tag your wife?
Sure. Why not?
Okay. Dasa, this is all live, people. Here we go. Okay. And one more share.
So
take over.
All right. So first of all, I was first of all really excited to schmooze with you. So like Baruch Hashem, we get to schmooze once again. But like when I was thinking about like this Hag of Lag BaOmer, I was like thinking specifically in its root, kind of, you have this yahrzeit of Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai, which means it's like the passing of a righteous person. And when you have a passing of a righteous person, there's this huge, tremendous energy that comes in the world that's like specific to that person's soul, right? But like also I was like thinking of, to really appreciate like this day, you really got to like appreciate what is going on in terms of like the Jewish festivals, right? And where it is in terms of, where it lives and what's going on energetically. What's the energetic divine flow that's happening in this day according to the mystical texts. And like really, so we got to like really understand that first of all, there's these three major holidays of in Judaism that are happening around like this time period, and most people know of two of them, but like the one in the middle is like seen as an intermediary days, but it's really like like considered a Hag of itself, right? That's extended over 50 days, really. So that's like, first of all, like an interesting, idea or notion is that like even according to Pshat, like according to the Rambam, that all these, according to the simple meaning of the text, there's like all these days in which that we're counting the Omer, and I'm going to say what that means in a second.
And the days in between, what we're in between.
Right, the in between days are considered like a holiday.
No, what are we between? We're in between two.
Oh yeah, right. So like the first holiday is Pesach, right, which is Passover, right, and that's and then you have the end day, right, which is the culmination point, which is the idea of Shavuot. So Pesach is a place where we left Mitzrayim, we left our Egypt, we left our constrictions. Eitan, are you with me still?
I'm with you. Okay. Can you see me?
No, I can't see you.
Oh yeah, I made it as in you got the mic right now, so I'm zooming in on you.
Okay, great. I'd
love to see you.
Okay,
all right. So okay.
Okay, so like, but in any case, like you have Shavuot, right, which is the combination of all the holidays, which is really the idea of us receiving the Torah, right? And you need to really understand or appreciate what these two things are in order to really understand what the intermediary days, which are counting the Omer, like is, right? So first of all, let's talk about leaving Mitzrayim. Let's talk about like leaving Egypt, right? This is the archetypal. This is the basis of all of Jewish practice, all of Jewish idea, right? And Mitzrayim is really like a code word for boundaries. It actually literally means in Hebrew, mitzar yam, like a constricted like sea, or like more aptly kind of like translated as constricted consciousness. And that's like really true slavery, which manifests into a physical slavery. So it was a physical reality, right, that we got out of. And not only that, not only is it historical, but it's something that's happening every single day. This is a tenet of Judaism in which that it says that a person needs to consider themselves every single day as if they're leaving Mitzrayim. They're leaving their personal boundaries and constrictions. And just to like kind of even kind of like connect like another idea into it that's very apropos given the day, you know, we're celebrating this day of Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai, right? That Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai is is associated with the bringing out of the Zohar, the magnus opus of Jewish mysticism, right? And really, in this magnus opus of Jewish mysticism, what's really going on? As a Tana, as like a rabbi writing the oral laws about 2,000 years ago, he was known particularly about wanting to know the inner dimension or the inner reason for the Jewish laws.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Sure.
So just to vibe on that concept of knowing the inner reason for the Jewish laws, the idea is that, there's you could say the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, right? There's the commandment itself, but then there's why are we doing this? And right. As soon as you go below the surface, it's like the iceberg, as soon as you go below the surface, it's like multiple layer upon layer upon layer to the deepest levels of the human psyche to beyond the human psyche in terms of why we are doing what we're doing in the Jewish religion.
Right. And I also want to add to that, like really, right, is that what I think is significant for myself, right, is that there's like a perspective of Torah, which is true, right, which is that there was an event that happened, which was leaving Egypt. There was an event that happened that was receiving the Torah. There was an event happened that we received commandments, and it happened through a process of the oral law of bringing down what that like really meant. And then we have the Jewish people as a history, right? And we have these historic events that are leading to us. And why are we following the laws? Because there was this historical moment of like the giving of the Torah or leaving Egypt. But what's significant to me is actually the perspective of the Zohar. And really, it's like bringing out like this idea that we mentioned of like leaving Egypt every day is incumbent upon every single person. Is it's not merely speaking about historical truths, as the Zohar is like kind of like saying, is that.
And can you just say what the Zohar is really quick?
Yeah, so the Zohar is a magnus opus, right, of Jewish mysticism, right, and it's attributed to Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai, who's today is his yard site, right, and it's also like interestingly called his Hilula, which means his wedding celebration, because when a righteous person is moving into the higher worlds and returning back to his source, it's a huge celebration because like all of a sudden he's completed his work over here.
And what do you mean when you say returning back to his source?
So meaning that the way that we perceive particular souls, right, is that like the essence of what we are is a piece of God, right? But that piece of God, so to speak, needs to come down into the world. Why does it come down into the world? Well, according to our mystical text, there's the overall reason for all of creation is in order to create like a dwelling place down below, because there was a desire for the infinite to create a dwelling place in the lowest realm. What's the lowest realm? It's a place where separation is most apparent, right? So how is that going to come down and interact with in this world? It's going to come in and interact with this thing called like a soul, which is a piece of God, right? And then all of a sudden it gets like some sort of form or identity as it's going down into a body and then working within the matrix in order to reveal infinity within details.
One of my favorite metaphors is that our bodies are a time-space suit for our soul, right? That in order to exist in time and space in this temporary finite context, because we're a piece of the infinite, just as an astronaut needs a spacesuit, to leave Earth and survive in the vacuum of space, so too to exist in this causal realm of separation and beginning and middle and end, we need a time space suit,
which is our
body.
Right. And then the shama and the soul, right, is like kind of like this intermediary actually between our body and the infinite, like the endless light, right? And it's I won't go into more details of that. I think we could speak about that for a real long time. But what I'm saying is that like every person, just so to speak, their whole lifetime, when it's filled to its full purpose, right, becomes a revealed aspect of godliness that is coming down into this world. And the righteous person represents the completion of that full mission, right?
Okay,
so
can I unpack that for a second? Because this is all so deep. When you say that a righteous person represents the completion of that mission, what you're saying is that when we use the term righteous person in Hebrew, you're talking about the idea of a tzaddik, right? Like a tzaddik, the tzaddik, right?
Right.
And so the idea being that they have refined their character and gotten past their ego enough, right? Because so much of what you're talking about when you talk about this mission, you're talking about the mission of truly being able to see God. But in order to truly be able to see God, we need to see past ourselves, our finite selves, our egos. And when we're able to do that, that's the completion of that mission. And so a righteous person is a person who's been able to cross over that boundary of the small self into a place of mochin de gadlut, and rather than Mitzrayim, which is the mochin de katnut, it's the mochin de gadlut. It's the expanded consciousness.
Right. And what I would add to that is that, there's it's really a two-part process. There's one part of like leaving the ego, right, which is now I know my true identity, which is not the body, right? It's like really being part of Hashem, right? But that's only step one, right? Then step two is like unifying your will, right, with this infinite will to want to express itself in the lowest realm. And then that's using the ego, using the body, right, as opposed to being used by the ego, being used by the body in order to express that godliness.
And on that note, in terms of used by the ego, used by the body, what you're talking about is, in my understanding, is being trapped by desire. That when we say getting past the ego, part of what we mean is not being a slave to our desires. The ultimate example of that, of course, is the addict, right? Who's basically lost his free will to whatever it is that is his desire, that fix that he must have, that he's even willing to destroy his life for, and God forbid, even to destroy himself, right? And if you ask him what he wants, he'll say he wants his fix, but he's not actually free. He's a slave to his ego. And so, go ahead.
Right. And also this kind of like echoes all the way back to the beginning of the Torah, right? That there's this idea of eating from the tree of knowledge. What's a tree of knowledge? It's the knowledge or the identification with you as a separate entity, right? But it's not supposed to be that was not supposed to be the case, right? It's that like separate entity, and the idea of separateness like allows for a revelation of like the togetherness, right? But then when it is like only experienced as itself outside of the whole context of unity, right? Then all of a sudden it loses its purpose, right? And that's what we're calling about like ego addiction, misappropriation, not fulfilling your mission, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's a beautiful idea is that the tree of knowledge, right, we were supposed to eat from the tree of knowledge, but we were only supposed to eat from the tree of knowledge after we ate from the tree of life first. We're supposed to unite the tree of life, which represents that unifying soul consciousness, with the tree of knowledge, which is the idea of boundaries. And connecting it back to like our idea is like Mitzrayim, our boundaries, Egypt, the things that we're leaving every day, right, is the Eitz Hadat, according to Panimiut Torah. It is the tree of knowledge, right? That is Mitzrayim. That is Egypt. That is our constriction. It's the feeling of like us as a self, right? But it's not supposed to be that that's the end purpose. And that's what I'm saying is that Pesach, Passover, and leaving those ideas of constriction would be completely devoid of what Judaism is supposed to be if there wasn't a Shavuot, right? And Shavuot represents this final process of, now that I've left my boundary, I've left my ego, now I'm able to like come in and use the ego, and I'm able to use the body, and I'm able to use the world in order to express the infinite into those details. And right? That's represented. Yeah, sorry.
And that's represented by the Torah, by the mitzvot.
Right. There's this beautiful idea that was given over by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, right? That he was kind of saying, what did it mean when the Torah was being given, right? And the Torah needs to say that there was no echo. Like, out of all the great things happen, we needed to know that there was no echo, right? And the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, really, what that's speaking about is that an echo happens is that when you have a voice and it comes out, right, and it's not able to interact with with something relatively more physical, which is like kind of like mountains and other physical objects. So what happens? It bounces back. Part of it bounces back, and that's why you have an echo. But the one of the miracles of the giving of the Torah was that voice, which was completely spiritual, was able to be absorbed by the harsh materiality of this world, right? And that's the idea of giving of the Torah, right? The idea of also the Torah. Another thing, we said that Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai's Hilula, his wedding celebration. What does that mean? That's really the question that we got into. Is that Shavuot was known as a wedding celebration between the infinite and Yisrael, right? And that's really kind of like what are the two parts? The masculine, feminine, or the bride and the bride and the bridegroom represent material and spiritual, right? And one last kind of like maybe one other idea that I wanted to add to that, like maybe kind of like connecting the themes, is one of the things that we do during Passover is we eat matzah, right? And matzah is this bread that is devoid of ego, because it's not like we eat it before it rises up. Like the ego rises up, right? So Passover like is about no ego, right? And leaving, and in order to leave like our constrictions, we have to have no ego, right? But what is the main offering of Shavuot? It's one of the only offerings besides the offering of Thanksgiving that now uses leavened bread that puffs up like the ego. And we use two of them, right? And that's the main offering, right? And we're able to use that because we've had this period of refinement, which is the middle days, which is called the Omer, right? And specifically in the Omer, we used to offer up a barley offering in the temple. And the barley offering in the temple like kind of represents animal feed as opposed to man feed, right? So, right? And also, this is also very, I think, Eitan, I think you'd, like we've spoke about this before, I know we have, but I just think it's amazing, this concept that this idea that the Kohen, when he's waving the barley offering, he's completely speechless. He's mute. He's like on the level of animal without speech. But then Shavuot, all of a sudden, it's about the voice of Torah. It's about like finding our voice, right?
I don't remember talking about that, but I'll take your word for it.
It was a good conversation.
Yeah.
So right. So okay. So now that I think we have those kind of like basics. Maybe I could go pack another layer in.
Yeah, and please bring back Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, because we launched into this conversation from this concept of what does it mean that he finished his mission.
Right. We got to know this, and this is also like very important. Is that like a tzaddik really, righteous person really chooses their day of their death, right? Like they're like on a spiritual level, right? Like on like a spiritual level, they're really kind of it's so there's a significance to this day, right? And why it's this day in particular. But just to say like this, it's that we have this idea of like, if you want to look at these three dynamics or these three holidays, right? And I'll just use one other analogy before I launch into what is this middle days. That Pesach is known as the beginning of the relationship, right? The beginning of the romance. I'm saying this as your wife is coming in home, so it's probably Seven Tov. And so
she's getting me some water, Baruch Hashem.
Oh wow, amazing.
Yeah,
so like,
Baruch atah Adonai melech haolam she'aklim bara.
Amen. So like the beginning, the beginning of the relationship and the beginning of the way that Pesach is described is we ran out into the desert without knowing if Hashem was going to provide for us. We were just like madly in love, and it was like the engagement, right? It was like really just like super exciting, right? But that like part of like the relationship, right, then transforms into a second part of the relationship, right? First, that first part of the relationship in the language of the Baal Shem Tov, who is a mystical master who brought out the teachings of Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai, in many centuries later, right? But like he writes that this first level is called hachna'ah. It's called submission, right? Pesach and the engagement is called submission. Why? Because it's like at this point of like love, it's like whatever you lose your identity to that of your lovers, right? Your lover wants to go to the ballet. You hate ballet, and you're just like, I don't care as long as I'm with you, right?
And so the Jewish people were willing to let go of the security of Mitzrayim, and they knew where their flesh pot was, and
right?
They ran into the desert,
right?
And even for that love,
yeah, and even like this model, right? You're going to see it fits relationships, but it's everything, and this is very pertinent. It's like it also fits childhood, right? Because the beginning of a child's birth, they're on this like level, right? They're completely machnia. They're completely like submitting to their parent, right? And and so that moves in, but there is no individual identity, right? And this is what you're talking about not having ego. What's ego? It's identity, right? And the second level is what the Baal Shem Tov calls havdalah, which means separation, right? And that's like the part of the relationship where you start to reclaim your identity in the relationship. She's like, wow, I wanted to go to ballet. And you're like, well, I'd rather like learn some Torah at home or whatever that thing is that you want to do, right? And that idea, and within childbirth, it's like the terrible twos, right? It's like a child starts to like develop his identity or being a teenager, right?
I was actually recently just with a child who's in his twos who just learned how to use the word mine.
Yeah, right. That's ego in the
yeah.
And when you see kids doing that, you're like, wow, Baruch Hashem, it's like
Yeah.
the most awesome thing in the world, because
Yeah.
they need to get an ego in order to move and then learn how to like let go of that ego, right?
It's part of the process.
Right. So it's part, right. So exactly. So it's all about like the second level is all about process. It's all about like, and part of that is like ego, it's separation, and it's a very scary process, right? It's a very scary process, and it's a process. Also in a relationship, it's very scary. It's much more exciting, the engagement than having to sit down and work and have a serious conversation about your feelings and to work through things, right? But then the third level, right, is then, the finale of the relationship, right? It's a coming together, right? It's where both ego or separate self and no self and hachna'a could integrate. It's about integration, and that level, according to the Baal Shem Tov, is called hamtaka, sweetening, right? And that idea of like sweetening is like the pinnacle of like a relationship where you're able to be two individuals, but like there's such a synthesis between you two that it shows a deeper beauty that you're able to be both different and have such a bond than if one person was just completely nullified to the other.
Right. It's like thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Right. And also, just to say again, since we mentioned Adam and Eve, right? In the beginning, they were described as being back to back, right? Which is that first process. Then they were separated, which is a deep sleep, which goes on exile and separation and harshness. And then, but all of that was in order that they should come together face to face.
So just to reflect, the first phase, what's the Hebrew word for it?
It's called hachna'a.
Hachna'a is like basically it's like this undifferentiated self, which is in a state of oneness, but it's a state of oneness in which there is no ability to be in relationship because it's a state of oneness without a self.
Right.
And then the second stage is Havdalah, in which the self exists, but with the coming of the self comes separation. Right. But with that separation comes the ability to actually be in a relationship.
Right.
But nonetheless, with that separation also comes tension. And also comes turning away, and also comes difficulty, and also comes all these things. But the idea is that through riding that out, right? In men's work, there's the idea of different archetypes, and they say that that the archetype associated with the beginning of the relationship is the lover, right? Because the lover wants to know and be known and connect, and it's this fire, and it's so good, and I just want to be with you. Right. And that's like the, going to the ballet, even if you're not into it, right? You just want to be with that person, right? It's the lover, like I'll do anything, right? But then eventually that love can kind of like the heat gets turned down, and then the relationship gets sustained by the warrior. Right. Because the warrior says, I'm committed. I'm in. It's not just about whether or not I have some deep emotional rush.
Right. So these are like actually the dynamics. This is an important thing to say, is there's a shadow and light to each one of these stages, right? So meaning that what you're describing is the light of these stages. If you do it right, you turn on the warrior.
Right. If you do it right, and then eventually you get to the sweetening, which is then it's like, oh, wait, like now we can come back. And it's not just like this love is blind. It's like, actually, no, love is conscious.
And love what is that? Is that the king or is that the magician?
Actually, I don't know. We always stop there. I think it's actually that the lover comes back, but in a more conscious way.
Right. I mean, I like to think that it's almost like the magician in a sense, because the magician is doing some sort of transformation, right?
Right. He's holding space for the opposites.
Right. That's beautiful. Wow. So yeah, so what it's saying is that like, so I'm going to introduce one last kind of like maybe a couple more concepts in order that we can like just piece together what this day is. A lot of hakdamas, a lot of introductions.
We're riding, man. We're on a ride. We're in.
So basically, the way that this is also spoken about is that there's three states of consciousness in Judaism. Chachma, right? Which means the kind of consciousness that you see everything but in one shot, right? And it's a seed idea before, like it's a eureka moment when you see everything in one flash, and it's awesome, right? And that's the idea of Pesach, and that's the idea of a hachna'ah. That's the idea of all of like complete submission because you're overwhelmed by this like spiritual experience, right? Then you go into the second place of differentiation, which is called in Jewish consciousness, it's called Bina, right? Which is called like the way of comprehend, which is translated. I'd like to translate it as comprehension as opposed to conception, right? So comprehension requires you to break things up into parts, into details, right? But then it's, Bina is a lot less exciting than that eureka moment. When you explain that spiritual experience to yourself, right? It's a lot less exciting than the moment that it hit you, right? And then you go into the last part, which is Shavuot, which is dot or keter, right? Which is really the idea of synthesis of the full picture and the parts, right? What's very interesting is
wait, you gotta explain dot as in you gotta unpack dot more.
Yeah, dot is really an internalization into the body, right?
So you got the inspiration. It's like, oh my God, I got it. Like, this is amazing. Right. I understand it. And then you have Bina, which is like, okay, but in order to actually implement this or break this down or actually make this happen, in order to go from, to use some more Kabbalistic terminology, from Keter to Malchut, it's like, okay, how are we going to do this? I want to build a bridge. I saw a bridge. I have a dream. I saw this insight, this vision of this bridge. It's going to be awesome. Right? People are going to go across it. It's going to be so much better than rowing a boat across, like, and then it's like, okay, well, man, we got to get the steel and we got to get the workers and we got to get the money to pay for it. And we got to get all the actual parts that make up that perfect vision. That's the Bina, right?
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. I would say like dot is like this. I heard this interesting idea about dot, that it's really, you don't learn anything new with dot, right? It's just like feeling what you already know, right? So it's like an internalization into your emotional capacity and capabilities, right? But the inner aspect of dot, right, is the idea of keter. Right, and Keter is our will. It's the person.
Keter means crown.
Yeah, it means crown, and literally, it is the I that is either choosing to see it in parts or to see it in wholeness. It's able to will things from a place of true free choice, right? And it's like that's the idea of Shavuot is both those ideas. It's like through Keter, right? And Torah is called Keter, right? Because it's straddling those, because from God's essence, right, spiritual and physical are the same before him, and they could be united. And so you need to go in that place to unite the two. But uniting those two is the soul being able to be communicated in the body, right? And that's like the point, right? And so like I'd say like this, right? When you're going, so this last stage over here, right? Okay, so this is the other piece of Kabbalistic insight that we need to like unpack in order to appreciate these days, right? The first day on Pesach, we get everything, but it's one seed and it's in one shot, right? Bina, right? There's a really interesting idea of Bina that is, right, that it's the mother to all emotions.
Can you translate Chachma, Bina, and Dot really quick into English?
Right. I would say now I'm translating it like completely not like how it gets translated. It gets translated as wisdom,
understanding, and knowledge.
And knowledge. I'm translating it as conception, comprehension, and internalization.
Deep.
Right. So, and those are not my translations. I'm kind of, using like a lot of the Hasidut that, like I think is a better idea of what it is in the English translation.
Can I just put in a little parentheses?
Sure.
So one of the ways I'm understanding in my own language, Chachma, Bina, and Dot, is there's an idea that a person has a peak experience, right? Like, let's say they realize the unity of God, or they like realize that everything is love, or they realize that they have some sort of realization about why things haven't been working out with their brothers, some sort of insight. Right. So it's like a peak experience.
Right.
But then
I think the way when you said that, what came to my mind is your experience of going to the Kotel. Right. Like like where you had this.
Right. That I was home before I even understood what that meant.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. That's a very good example. And so you have a peak experience, and there's a phrase that I read from Ken Wilber, a thinker named Ken Wilber. He said that altered states need to become stable traits. That like, and that's that process that you're describing of Chachma, Bina, Dot, right? That you have Chachma, you have this peak experience, you have this insight, right? Then you have Bina, which is comprehension, right? Which is like, so concept comprehension, which is like, okay, I just had this insight, but now I got to change my life. Maybe I need to start running. Maybe I need to go to a therapist. Maybe I need to, like, whatever it is, in some way, shape, or form, I got to work on myself based on this insight, based on this new conception that I had. And then finally, there is internalization, right? Which is Dot, which is also translated as knowledge, where it's like, okay, got it. It's a stable trait now. Like, okay, like I actually made the tikkun, like I've actually changed. I've actually become a different person through internalizing this, what was originally an insight. Because the thing about that insight, the thing about that peak experience is it's fleeting, and it could also disappear. You can have that peak experience, you can have that insight, and then that's it.
Right. Exactly. It's like, it's right. Exactly. And what's kind of like interesting is, what is that, right? It's like really the breaking down of it is like the experiencing of it, right? Like piece by piece. But when you're experiencing it piece by piece, it's a fractured reality, right? And the experience connotes emotion, right? So what we say in that this idea of comprehension, I mean, of our understanding, what we call Bina, right, is the mother of these 7 primal emotions, right? And these 7 primal emotions, like the first one being the basic 2 root ones are like desire and resistance, right? Like, or love and fear, like, or yeah, like Hesed and Gevurah, right? Exactly. And Tiferet, which is like, gets translated as compassion, or beauty as synthesis. And then like the emotions that have to do with like, how am I going to give that over to the other, which is another 3. And finally, the manifestation of it, which is like the Malchut, where is how do I come out? To say very quickly, but there's 7 base emotions, right? And that understanding, right, is the mother of those, right? But each one of those emotions needs another emotion to express itself, right? So meaning that that there's like a loving kindness of loving kindness, right? Which is like that you need to have like that charge of wanting to come out with your love in order for that love to like come out and manifest. And there's also like restraint of the loving kindness, meaning that you need to hold back in order to show love, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it goes on, and there's 49 pieces to that.
And that's
right?
the 49 days of the Omer.
Right, and that corresponds to 49 days of the Omer. But those represent different emotion, all the different possible archetypal emotions,
Mm-hmm.
right? But when all of those emotions are experienced fully, then it opens up something which is connecting all of those emotions, right? Which is the idea of like really Shavuot, right? And it's the idea of Keter, and it's the idea of all of like these things. And it's the idea of like what the Zohar calls the 50th gate, the 50 gates of Bina, of understanding, right? Or like comprehension. And also the Zohar mentions that there's 50 mentions of leaving Mitzrayim, of leaving Egypt, which correspond to these 50 gates. Right?
So by the way, what is Lag BaOmer?
Okay, so yeah, so now we get to go into this part. Right? So this is a deep secret, and I don't like I think for the sake of trying to stay cohesive with the concepts, we're going to like kind of speak very generally, but there's another way of looking at these 7 weeks, right? Is that these 7 weeks builds up like the whole, like your whole consciousness bit by bit, right? So the Omer, right? And what does that mean? That means that the first 4 weeks, right, builds up the Chachma, which is like the comprehension, right? That's why the first week is on Passover is considered Yom Tov. It's a festive day, a festive week. The second week, which represents Bina, again, it's like the idea of separation. And then the consequent 2 other weeks represent the part of dot, the part of internalization, which has to do with coming out or giving of chesed, and the part of internalization that has to do with holding back, right?
Okay.
So really that's why, like, if you look at a men's tefillin, it has 4 compartments to it, right? Because it represents these 4 parts, and those 4 parts represent these 4 first weeks of the Omer, right? And the next 3 weeks of the Omer represent Hesed, like
the last 3 weeks of the Omer.
The last 3 weeks of the Omer represents the 3 primal emotions of Chesed, Gevura, and then Tiferet, right? And the last day, which is Shavuot, represents it all coming down into Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchut. It's like coming down into the body fully, right? But that last, so now we have that in mind. Sorry, we got to hold all these pieces together, right? But basically, as we're developing the mind, and we're like the first 4 weeks, right? It's fractured state. It's like when you don't have the full idea, when you don't have the full picture, like maybe like right now, like, I'm talking and it's like the full picture is not like there as I'm explaining the idea.
Actually, I think I'll tell you what could bring it together is just to go into the weeks again. You said that there's 5 weeks that make up the Omer, right? The first 2 weeks are
7 weeks, right?
7 weeks. Sorry, there's 7 weeks that make up the Omer. So the first 3 weeks are Chachma Bina Dat.
The first 4 weeks are Chachma Bina Dat, right? Because the dot is divided into 2. That's like you see, like the tefillin, like the middle part is like has 2 pieces of dot.
Okay, so the first 4 weeks are Chachma Bina Dat, and the last 3 weeks are Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferet.
Right. So what do you have after the first 4 weeks, after the 28 days? Now you have the full picture mentally, which is 28 days, right? Now when you go down into the weeks, there's a process that mimics what goes on in Pesach, where first this higher consciousness comes in, and then we deal with our constricted consciousness. And now like Lag BaOmer is that last day where we deal with our constricted consciousness, and it's like kind of like the brain and the body, the brain and the consciousness is now able to come down into the emotions and into the body now.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this, according like to Kabbalah, the Arizal, the intentions of like these holidays represent this process in which that, first of all, the mind is in consciousness. Now you have the full picture, right? It's a difference. Like if I wanted to explain this in an analogy, right? Hakma, right? It's like you see the full picture at once, right? And that's why Hakma is likened to seeing. Bina is likened to hearing, right? So you can only hear one detail at a time. But there's a certain point in the story where things collate and it's no longer details anymore. It like comes to be a full picture. And that like kind of like represents this idea of the full brains coming in, the Hakma Bina dot. But now that full picture comes in, now it needs to come down to excite me, to stimulate me. And that's what Lag Omer represents.
And Lag Omer is Hod Shebehod, right?
Right. So in the emotions, it actually kind of like is this idea of like that always the day of it, like kind of like finally like coming in, or it's like final thing is Hod in each one of the weeks. But like really like Hod Shebehod is like it's a very deep concept. It's like kind of like pulling back in submission in order to like kind of like completely like kind of receive, right? So there's a lot to say about that and how that the midot kind of like correspond to like the consciousness.
Can I pivot for a second and just tell us a story about Shimon Bar Yochai that changed my life?
Yeah.
So I know I'm sure I've told this to you before, but I was inspired earlier today just thinking about it. So there's a story that basically Reb Shimon had to go into hiding from the Romans.
Right.
Because he criticized the Roman government and someone informed on him.
Right.
And so Reb Shimon was a tzaddik. Reb Shimon was a person who was doing that inner work of getting past his ego. And so during this period of time when he went into hiding, he was living in a cave with his son Eliezer. And there's all kinds of stories how all these miracles happened. A carob tree grew right next to the cave, so they would have something to eat. And also it was something like, correct me if I'm wrong, it was like a stream, like rerouted itself so they could get water or something. Like it was like all these miracles.
There was a Mayan that like came into the cave.
Right. And but the thing that really strikes me, which changed my life, is that, growing up in a very consumeristic culture, I had a strong rejection of physicality, because growing up, in a culture in which it almost seemed as if you were being told that the purpose of your life is to look good, have sex, and buy stuff until you die, and like no concept of giving, no concept of meaning, no concept of kindness. It's just look good, buy stuff, and have sex. It's just like it's empty and shallow. And so when I started my spiritual journey, there was like a strong rejection of physicality, because what I wanted was spirituality, right? So I'm just putting that as a layer as I tell the story. And so Rebbe Shimon goes into the cave, and he's in the cave for, I'm blanking on the number. Is it 7 years?
7 years.
7 years. Okay. So he's in the cave for 7 years, and then he comes back and he meets somebody, and he asks them a question. Can you give over the midrash that he meets someone?
Yeah. So he sees somebody doing like every day,
a mundane activity, farming.
Farming, right? And he looks at him and he like completely fries him.
Right.
Like,
so basically it's like Reb Shimon is like tuned into like cosmic energy, right? And it's like, what's the most important thing? God. What's the truth? God, right? And he goes and he talks to this guy, and the guy just starts talking about like these normal, mundane physical things. And in my version of the story, it's like Reb Shimon's like, don't you know the only thing that matters is God? And it's like, and it's
right.
The guy gets burned up. right? And so the thing is that there's a level at which Reb Shimon is right.
Right.
There's a level at which Reb Shimon is right, but that's not the Jewish path. The Jewish path is not a renunciate path. The Jewish path is not a path which rejects the physical, right? And so then Hashem says, did I create my world so you could destroy it? Go back in your cave. And so then he goes back in the cave for, I believe, another year, right?
Yeah.
Wait,
I think it's 6 years.
Okay. He goes back in the cave. And then he comes back out again and he meets somebody and he says, what are you doing? And he's carrying 2 branches of myrtle and he says, what are these for? He says, Shamor and Vizachor, for remembering the Sabbath, right? And they say, and then Reb Shimon was consoled, right? And it's like, okay, I can be in the world. So it's like 2 things happened at the same time. One is Reb Shimon came out and it's like he was able to he had an interaction in which he met someone again, just like the first story, but that person said that these physical things that I'm holding are for Shamor V'Zachor. They're for the Sabbath, that the physical world can actually exist in a state in which it's a vehicle to realize God, right? And then Reb Shimon was able to leave the cave. He was able to come out of the cave and be in the world. And that was such a challenge for me because for so many years, it was like, don't you know the most important thing is God? Why are you talking about the news? Why are you talking about whatever you're talking about? It's like someone once made fun of me that they would ask me how are you doing? It's like, why are you asking me how I'm doing? It's like, sorry, because it's like, don't you know that there's what matters is truth and this trite question, it's like, and so it took me years, and that story challenged me to my core. It challenged that part of me that rejected physicality, that rejected worldliness, that rejected, I don't want to deal with the BS of the world, right? And it really challenged that part of me because Reb Shimon was told, I did not create my world so you could destroy it. He wasn't told that he was wrong, right? He was just told that, hey, there's actually a bigger picture than the truth that you're tuning into, which is that yes, the most important thing is God. There's an even bigger picture than that.
Right. I think there's so many deep things over here, especially with this story, and I think it's really connected, right? Because with the process that you're kind of speaking about, right, or Rebbe Shimon is kind of moded that the world needs to exist, right, and there could be physicality for being used for spirituality, is the idea of Shavuot, right? So then the idea is, why wasn't Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai's Hilula on Shavuot? Why was it in Lag BaOmer, right? And I think that this is a very deep secret, and I hope that I'm able to tie it in, or bring it in. In that story that you mentioned, what's very deep about it is that where he went into hiding was in Lod, right? That the Romans were wanting to kill him, and Lod is a special place in the Gemara because it was so Roman occupied that in the laws of Jewish divorce, right, it would be considered, if you sent a divorce document to Lod from Eretz Yisrael, it would be considered another country, right? So when you're looking at the analogy, not only was he getting his spirituality or his cave in what he was going in the darkest deepness of exile and hiding, but it's a paradox because it was still Eretz Yisrael. It's still a land of expanded consciousness, and was still in exile, right? The second thing about the story that really kind of struck me when I was looking at it was that what does he sustain himself with? Water and carobs, right? So I always was what is the meaning of this? Why does even if it happened, it's the Zohar. The Zohar itself, it says that the whole Torah is not stories; it's angels putting in, using the garments of the Hebrew letters, right? So it's not coming to teach us this trite, cool miracle, right? So haruv, which means carob in Hebrew, is also the same word as destruction, and also the same word and has the same gematria, the same numerical value as gavura, right? As like constriction and like, right, and harshness, right? And if you look at like what it is, right, this fruit, it like looks like the tree of death, right? Like it's beautiful and awesome. I love carobs, right? But like they're like just like these black fruits that are not soft, they're hard, right? And so he's the tzaddik, right? He's an archetypal righteous person. And he's living off water, which is a symbol of like pure spiritual light, right? But that pure spiritual light, that easiness of the water is allowing him to transform the darkness, which is represented by the destruction, the word destruction of haruv, and the darkness of the fruit. And he's able to transform it and like able to transform the physicality of the world through that water. But where is he doing all of it? He's doing it in exile. He's not doing it in redemption, right? And so like, what is this, right? What is this saying? It's saying that like that, yes, there is Pesach, right? There's the high, you know, like experience of like leaving out, right? And then there's also Shavuot, right? Which is the end process. Or like in our example, like Bezrat Hashem, it's like full redemption of the world, right? It's like the messianic kind of like concept of like, you know, fullness, right? But then there's this thing in between. There's load, right? There's the exile. And even there, the tzaddik is able to go down and find some sort of wholeness to carry us into the rest of the time of the exile until the final like completion. And that connects with this concept that I'm saying, right? Of that, like according to the mystical intentions of the Arizal, right? That really, it's like at this point in which that Bina is, you know, that separate consciousness is manifesting, is now switching over, that there's some sort of level of wholeness within the fractured pieces. You're getting some sort, it's a point of the story. It's like, you're telling me like a story, right? And at first I'm confused. I hear all the details. I hear the Devar Torah. Things are flying. But then it's not, it's before like you get to the punchline, but it's to a point like right before where you're just like, wow, I'm starting to see how this beauty is coming together. And that's the Torah of Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai, and that's the light of Lag BaOmer.
Moshe, on that note, I think we should wind it up with a bracha.
Yeah. So this is, I think that Hashem should bless us, you know, all with like real connection this year to Pnimiut, to his inner wisdom, right, and his inner light, right, and that like that inner light that's leading and guiding our life is able to bring the two opposites together of complete physicality and complete materiality to show that they're one thing.
Complete spirituality.
Complete spirituality and complete physicality, and to show that they're one thing in his eyes, and that everything is like Hashem. Everything is Hashem. Everything is Simcha, and everything is, and everybody should have all the shefa, all the abundance that they need physically, and all the abundance that they need spiritually, and they should be able to do all of it with the light of like the Pnimiut of Torah.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Moshe.
Thank you so much, my brother. It's really
okay. Great. I'm gonna close out the live, and we're gonna stay on.
Okay, wonderful.